You are reality. Reality is single. There's only what is, and it's always blossoming forth with no separations. And it's radically intimate, radically unbounded, infinite, and it's utterly peaceful and utterly absorbing, and it's totally free of suffering, totally free of any concern for anything. And it's meaningless in the most wonderful way. It's just complete play and expressiveness. And then there's this impression that there's a you who thinks it's bad or good. And then if you stop resisting, you realize that there isn't actually a separate self, a separate thing. There's just what's here. And without judgment, it's utterly perfect, utterly whole, utterly complete, utterly free from suffering. That's a kind of an irony, is that the level of shedding the struggle, stopping the struggle with reality, to do that at the deepest level, we actually need to fall in love with the world exactly as it is.
Guy here. My awesome guest today is Dr. James Cooke, and I believe we have something truly extraordinary for you today. Let me get my words out. It's not every day that you meet a neuroscientist who is immersed in the rigor of academic work, academic science, who has also experienced a profound spiritual awakening, right? So his journey of awakening and how it reshaped his understanding of the mind, the body, and reality itself. Now, but it doesn't stop there either, because he challenges conventional ideas around mental health, trauma, and healing. Look, it's a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it. It's one that makes more sense when you listen to it in its entirety. Definitely take notes on this one, because some of the conversation gets dense, but when it sinks in, it's very powerful. So the journey through science of spirituality, the nature of healing, and we dive into the future of humanity itself as well, and if we all embraced these very things that we discuss in the conversation today. Be sure to let me know in the comments below where you are in the world. If you enjoy it, make sure you hit the thumbs up. If you feel it's worthy of a like, share it with a loved one or friend. Let me know where you are. Connect. Hit the comments. And of course, links are below if you want to find out what we're up to in 2025 through our retreats and one-day events within Australia, Bali, and Croatia. It is all happening. Much love from me. I hope I get to meet you in person one day soon. Enjoy this podcast. James, welcome to the podcast, my man.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
I know you're in Portugal at the moment, which is an absolutely gorgeous place, sitting in your retreat centre there. We were speaking off air, I was only there last year. But I find it fascinating with your background, what you do, or where you've ended up, and what you've ended up doing really as well, and your exploration along the way. So I'm going to ask you the first question I ask everyone, is that if you were at an intimate dinner party right now and you sat next to a stranger and they asked you what you did for a living, how would you respond?
That's a good way to phrase it, because I feel like I have two different answers, well, probably many answers, but if it's just your run-of-the-mill random person you're sitting next to, I probably have a different answer than I would give to you or to the people listening who are already kind of down the rabbit hole to some extent. So I can try and give a short one of both, and to the average person who's not like actively into this stuff, I would say I'm a neuroscientist and writer, and the way I typically say to not scare people off is that I kind of talk about meditation and how it's not supernatural. It's kind of deepens you into reality, and science can really show how that's the case. And science and spirituality. But then to someone who's signaled they're on the same kind of wavelength, I would talk about how as a teenager I had an awakening, and that really has been the kind of through line of my life, that I went to science because it was a discovery of the real, it was like waking up to reality. It wasn't anything taking me away from reality. It was deepening me into reality. And so I was like, wow, like science has got to, given that this is real, it seems, so real. Science presumably has got a lot to say about this. So that's kind of what made me interested in the mind and consciousness and science. So now I have a retreat center, and I write. I have a book coming out, Dawn of Mind, and I'm a science spirituality guy, basically.
I love it. And just on that then, especially you mentioned neuroscience as well, and why did you go into that modality of study, and how would you best explain it for the layman? And also then, how is that supporting the deeper exploration that why we're on this podcast. You know, what is consciousness? What is reality? And how do we play a part in it?
Yeah, so my journey's I've always kind of trusted a kind of organic, intuitive, step-by-step thing of following what feels right. So my undergraduate was initially to study, I had the option of either doing psychology and philosophy or what's called experimental psychology, which isn't just like wacky, crazy psychology, but it's when it's grounded in experiments in like brain scans, like the really rigorous stuff. Like we didn't cover any Freud, we didn't anything you can't like dream stuff. Like if you can't test it, it's not included in the syllabus. So I basically studied that kind of like neuroscientific psychology because I was interested in the mind. And then the more I took the neuroscience modules, I was like, this is so cool. Like I also have a bit of a kind of, I really like kind of like electrical engineering-y type, like I go into like circuits and stuff like that. And so that it really, I was like, this is so powerful. Like it's so cool that we can actually start to crack the code of the brain. So there was part of me, the neuroscience wasn't solely secondary to the spirituality. There was also just a thing of like, this is so cool. Like I want to discover how the brain works. Just curiosity level. Because it seemed like if you're going to spend your time studying anything, like that's one of the big unsolved things, and it's at the core of who we are in some sense. But then it all kind of came together, and that's what I mean by the organic, intuitive way of stepping forward. Because I couldn't tell you, I did it because solely for this reason or this reason or this reason. It's just like everything converges to be like, I'm where I need to be. Everything's coming together.
If you had to then describe the study of neuroscience, then would you just say it's a study of the nervous system in relation to the brain and body, or? Yes,
exactly. Study of the nervous system is a great way to describe it, because the brain is a subpart of the nervous system. Yes, the nervous system spreads the whole body. If you're feeling any sensations in your fingertips, that's because nerves are responding and sending signals to the brain. It's the kind. I wasn't like a clinician or anything like that. I was doing academic research in a university, and so that's very much like we need to figure out how the brain works. So you can run studies with brain scans and that kind of stuff, or sometimes people do stuff in dishes with it goes all the way down from like genes all the way up to whole brain areas, and it's a very it's a cool field because it's really at the intersection of like you could say it's a form of biology, but a lot of the people studying it are coming to it from like computer science. I mean, AI came out of neuroscience research, computational neuroscience, so people doing kind of models of how the brain works. That is literally, it's like, okay, you've got the brain, that's intelligent. Here's a model of the brain. Oh, wait a minute, now my model is intelligent because I've successfully modeled aspects of the brain. Great, now we can sell this as AI. That's basically the story of how we got the modern AI. It's a very cool and important field.
Wow. I'd have to ask you as well, like relating back to my journey and yours, if I was sitting at that dinner table, I'd have to ask you then around the relationship between trauma, the nervous system, and how we perceive reality. Because I know for a fact that you mentioned you had skin conditions, I believe as a kid, you had gut issues, and I'm sure other emotional issues as well. Like myself, I kind of grew up with that. And I'm fascinated to hear your perspective on how that is affecting the body, how we perceive reality, and why is the body holding it? Like, please share a bit your story and then what you've learned along that journey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so when it comes to the scientific explanation around it, there's a weird, people, sometimes forget that scientists are humans. They are apes like the rest of us that have their own biases and instincts and stuff. And there's a kind of groupthink that kind of groupthink emerges in any place. But the kind of person who's interested in science, often, in my experience, the stereotypes are true, that there's a kind of spectrum. The more kind of people who are more in the kind of emotional stuff and kind of stuff we'll be talking about today are less well represented in science. Often is people who are very heady. In my own experience, I think part of the reason I was good at the analytical stuff was because I was so uncomfortable in my embodied experience as someone with a lot of trauma. So I can extrapolate from my own experience, and this is speculative. I'm not going to pretend I know what everyone's motivation is for studying stuff. But in my own experience, trauma leading to chronic tension, so this gets into the science you're asking about. When you have, the reason I'm mentioning this is that the conventional neuroscientific explanation, especially say like 10 years ago, before things like The Body Keeps the Score and these books that are now popular became more mainstream, would have been very much that, kind of trauma is something to do with memories being stored in the brain, very brain-centered and like very disembodied. And so you might understand flashbacks about how like memory parts of the brain are connecting with visual parts of the brain. But the way I understand it, especially having gone through a healing process, is in a far more embodied way, where the body is, and your relationship to the world and the meaning that's there is really important. So, you know, you take something like having low mood, which I did which I now understand was as a result of carrying trauma that was unresolved. The thing we're told in science is that, you know, a plausible explanation of that is you just have low serotonin. Maybe you've got your brain's, you know, on this side of the spectrum, and that's why you're depressed. That's just made up. Like, that doesn't have any scientific backing. Like, no one actually who studies like really in the science thinks that's what depression is. It does relate to modulators, but that simple idea that serotonin is a happy hormone that goes up, that is low in some people, and that depression is low serotonin disorder. That's like a PR thing for pharma companies, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, just like it literally is. So, you know, in my own case, what I discovered was that my low mood was meaningful. I'd grown up in a situation where, that, as most of us do, the networks of care that are supposed to be there, that humans have had throughout the vast majority of their evolutionary history, where there would be dozens of people you're intimately connected with who, in a culture that has a wisdom of maybe like healing traditions and connection with nature, that just wasn't there, you know. So in growing up in an individualistic culture with lots of intergenerational trauma and stresses and, you know, personal things going on in my family of origin, meant that I was in a very tense, very hypervigilant, activated state. And so that would correspond with, outside of the brain, we have other branches of the nervous system, like the sympathetic nervous system is the one that makes your heart beat fast, and the kind of fight, flight, you know, mobilizes you to respond. So I was living in a kind of chronic sympathetic activation, in the sense, you know, shallow breathing into the chest, tension around the stomach, not relaxed, in a relaxed, calm way. But it was, the funny thing is, I mean, it's not funny, but the weird thing is that that chronic bodily tension, which I think we all have to some extent, just a kind of a tonic vigilance, is so tied up with our perception of kind of subject-object difference of being a self in the world, and that you don't even notice it as you objectify the body and feel that, well, this is just my body. I've got back pain. That's not meaningful. It's tense. It's like an object that's broken in some way. It's not meaningful. And then this part of it is about realizing that you are the body in a sense. I mean, there's like a full stack of what you are, but the body can go from feeling like an object and you're in the head and you're the owner of the body, to feeling like you are the embodied subject. You are like think of an organism like a slug or a worm, something where its whole body is clearly so intimately connected with the wider world as it's feeling its way through. We're obviously like that, with our skin being our biggest organ. Like, that is as much you as your brain is you. So it's not that we are the brain, you know, we are the whole thing and more, in terms of, you know, stretching out into the wider world. So I think for me, my secondary, you know, being chronically stressed out, you know, mainstream science and mainstream medicine didn't have any explanation as to why I had asthma and eczema and irritable bowel syndrome and just like a whole litany of issues. And all of them were speculated to be, there was never really an explanation given. It's just like, okay, you have this disorder, like you're physiologically disordered, presumably because of some genetic thing or some just, you know, bad luck of the draw. And then they all resolved as I, you know, reduced my chronic stress, as I healed trauma and I became more embodied and I let go of this tension. They went away, and it totally fits with the science. Like I do think we have. Well, I was going to say I do think we have to. There has to be a paradigm shift come in, because it's so simple once you've gone through this to see what health is and what healing is. But then the thing I mentioned before, the group think of science, if we keep having the scientists be the people who don't want to go on this journey, maybe they might not come over and actually see it the way that we're seeing it, because they refuse to because the healing stuff can be harder to see.
I think it, honestly, from my biased opinion, I feel it needs to be fundamental, because surely as a scientist, all we're after is the truth, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, or what is, and that keeps evolving and expanding and challenging the current paradigm, which propels us forward. So
I mean, the thing I said about scientists and groupthink and being fallible humans, the thing I love about science is that the method is a corrective to that. It's, you know, everywhere else actually you get to just revel in your unconscious biases. Science actually at least tries to hold us to account. It's not perfect at it, But so I do think I have some hope that it might go.
Okay.
Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's fine, because I'd love it if we were to explore that emotional embodied aspect of cell as well as the analytical, because we have at our retreats we've had definitely very analytical people come in, and all they've ever done is use thought and the thinking mind to work through a linear time frame in their entire life, and that's all and that's how we're dependent.
Right.
Which is very normal. But I was quite the opposite. I was a very kind of feel into everything, and I don't trust my thoughts at all half the time. But once you have that shift and that experience and that feeling, it's like the floodgates start to open, and then it allows us to see something from a very different perspective, which of course will influence the mind in a different way. Yeah.
And I think the thing I mentioned before about the childhood stuff of lacking networks of care, I think that's we're a social species who are meant to have some kind of holding, some, as you move towards this healing stuff, it's hard to do it alone. And it's good to have people who've gone on the path ahead of you to reassure you and to hold that space. So things like retreats, those kinds of things are absolutely crucial for the kind of thing we're talking about. It can't be done just through understanding it intellectually. Well, it can be done, but it's a slower and harder, more arduous process. So I think that basic human connection and the in-person physical connection that takes you into the body, into the meaning making in a relational way is really, really important with this stuff.
Yeah, I want to tap into a little bit more of your trauma in a moment, but just from your experience and study, like, what about ancestral trauma? And have you looked at that and
that's fascinating.
And the impact?
Yeah. I mean, in my own personal journey, something I've not spoken about much, but I've been very interested in my family lineage, because there's like multiple lineages of trauma, and like maternal side is all kind of working class Londoners, and that's a very kind of traumatic thing over the course of hundreds of years. And then I've got Irish who kind of the result of English colonization is a lot of trauma there, and then Jewish as well, and so there's like a lot of ancestral wounding that kind of comes down the line. And we now see in the science that there's epigenetics is the main way that this is studied, which is so when we look at life, the thing we're talking about in terms of the analytical reductionist, looking at the parts versus looking at the organization of the whole, of kind of meaning making and being in relationship to the world, that thing also plays out with how people think about life, where to me it's obvious that a living cell is a holistic, integrated thing where the life process is kind of at the fore, and the genes are like the instruction book that is being read out, and the genes are pretty kind of secondary to the process of living. And there are people who think this way in biology, but because of the dominance of the kind of reductionist, analytical, heady way of looking at parts, we actually, as soon as the kind of DNA was discovered, for the rest of the 20th century, the emphasis really became, great, DNA, like the rule book, let's just look at this. This is what life is. Life is just DNA. It's like and that was never the case. Like that was always people thought that the Human Genome Project was going to figure out all of biology, and then we code everything. We're like, oh, actually, this is really complicated because we're not factoring in the whole kind of complex loopy systems that these codes are being read out in. So I think with epigenetics, it's a corrective to basically say that it's saying other factors that influence the expression of genes that aren't just, it's not just the case you've got a rule book and it's read out in a really stepwise, simple way. You're in this evolving context. And so, I mean, if you think of the fact that, I think it's correct that the egg that we all, came from it existed, women are born with all their eggs. So that egg was actually present in the body of one's grandmother, because the fetus of your mother was in there with all the eggs. So if your grandmother experiences something stressful, there's a physical continuity between that experience and then you now. There's like literally the egg is in there, you become that egg. That egg becomes you. So over the course of like a century, you could have an event that happens, and then you were basically there in some form when that event happened. And so we now know that stresses like this can activate different genes and cause different trajectories of the development of the organism. So but even deeper than that, it seems that this stuff can get kind of echoed through the generations in terms of these changes. You don't actually have to physically be there, like in the sperm as well. You can get signaling that happens. So yeah, I think there's a huge amount. Science is really bearing out the idea that ancestral trauma does kind of carry down through the ages.
Wow, that's incredible. Thanks for that. I've not heard that. That is it's mind blowing when you put your mind to it, how that could be influencing our state of being from the get go. So on your journey then, I'd love to tap into that, because I believe you had an experience when you were about 13. Is that correct? And and when you spoke about the you're always in your head and disassociation, like, and that stress, was that from as far back as you could remember as a child as well? Was all that there then leading into your teens?
Yeah. So I think the it's not like there was a single event that was a trauma that, like it was a car crash or something like that. There was an atmosphere of, I think, of this embodied stress. There was just an atmosphere of trauma, basically, and you wouldn't know that at the kind of heady level, but on that embodied level of like picking up on safety and stuff like that, it's just there was. I think we have this kind of distribution of, some people get lucky and don't have too much of this, and there are places in reality where on our planet where people are just crushed by trauma from all sides. I think, as far back as I can remember, there was a vigilance, there was a kind of a feeling of disease and like being ill at ease. I think, the stuff I was just describing, stuff can get picked up in the womb as well. If a mother has a stressful event when a baby's in the womb, that can also start this kind of process. So I think people can, I don't want to overstate it as well, because it's never true. It's always true that we're in a balance of, with trauma, it's kind of like a closing down, a guardedness. Like the muscle tension is, I'm separating off from the world to try and protect my survival process. So that's an aspect of it. But it's always true that we are fundamentally open and connected with the world at all times. Even the most traumatized person who feels most disconnected is receiving support from the rest of the earth, from the oxygen that the plants are making, from, unseen hands of like humans who have, built the roads they drive on. Like our circumstance is one where we are embedded in networks of care, even if there's a fault in the system or a failure when it comes to just the basic Homo sapien, the things we would hope for in terms of people caring for us. So I don't want to overstate it to say that, we're not. Another way of looking at this is we're never broken. It can feel like with trauma that we're broken. It can feel like there's some, especially with trauma, there's often shame, and there can be this narrative, this self-critical narrative of just like, something's wrong with me, and that can, the truth that something's not right can be powerful to drive you to make change, but that can be a toxic belief system that leads you to believing there's actually something wrong with you, where in reality, reality is whole and perfect. It's like, on the absolute level, it's all interconnected and just exactly as it is. It takes a mind to judge and to say that's wrong, that's not right. So all of the conditioning that came to make you is exactly. It's hard to put into words when you're talking about this, because it's like, I wouldn't say kind of it's exactly as it's supposed to be, but I don't mean like in a fate way. It's just like it all comes together exactly as it comes together, and it's perfect. So that's just to remind people not to buy into the narrative of brokenness too much.
Yeah. So what happened when you were 13 then?
Sorry, I didn't get
that's all right.
So so I was raised in the Irish Catholic kind of side of my family, and in terms of religion, and with all this stress and trauma, I was again very heady, but I was also very conscientious. I was quite again hypervigilant, threat averse. So when I learned that there was supposedly this all-powerful God who was going to, and at this point I didn't have blind faith. I was about 13, and I was starting to think about this stuff, and I was like, all right, is there a God? Like, I'm questioning it. It isn't obvious to me there is. Like, I need some evidence. And so I was like, but I've been told I have to have blind faith, and if I don't have blind faith, this supposedly benevolent God is going to torture me in hell forever. But he's made me this way, but I can't have blind faith. Like, I can't find it anywhere. Like, but yet he's supposed to be benevolent, and so I went around and around in a loop trying to figure this out, and just pouring all of my emotional, I was like just the deepest rumination ever, just like utterly absorbed in this thing because I just had to figure it out. I was not going to stop thinking about it until I'd figured it out, because I'm just going to get on with my day, and then the possibility of hell for infinity is just like on the table. Like, no, like I need to solve this one way or another. And because I remember the infinity aspect of it was really palpable to me, the sense of like, if I don't figure this out, that's it for all time. Like, there's, so I was wrestling with this, and my kind of emotional state, my investment in the thinking, hit such a climax where, I think also because there was no solution to it, something happened where I just stopped thinking, and there was just a kind of a complete like dead end. And I think this is like in Zen Buddhism, they use koans like this, paradoxes that can't be figured out with the rational mind, that people are supposed to chew on like intellectually until they get this kind of stopping, where like the thoughts just stop. And then in that moment, there was just the most radical. I didn't do anything in that moment. I stopped doing the thinking, the kind of the identification with thought, and then it was just really obvious what our circumstances, like what's really going on. When we're thinking, we think what's really going on is, well, I'm really this body, or I'm inside this body, and the world is out there, and I'm navigating in the world, and that's really what's going on. But on one level that you can say that that's true, but on a deeper level, in your experience at all times, I would suggest what's really going on is that you are reality. Reality is single. There's only what is. And it's always blossoming forth with no separations. And it's radically intimate, radically unbounded, infinite. And it's utterly peaceful and utterly absorbing. And it's not even it. You can't objectify it because it's everything. And it's totally free of suffering, totally free of any concern for anything. It's meaningless in the most wonderful way. It's just complete play and expressiveness. And so I went from this like being on the verge of tears, like, probably just staring to the middle distance, looking down in my lap, like stress. And then it stopped. And then there was just the most, I remember like wanting to like shout with joy, because I was just like, oh my God, like it's fine. Like I was doing this to my, like the whole thought paradigm. I was doing it to myself. The suffering, the feeling of bondage, the feeling of like, I'm suffering and this is bad and this is weighing heavily on me. There wasn't even a me. Like that was also an interpretation. There's like, again, there's a body that's like an energetic process, but like the James that takes ownership in the mental space of like, well, this is bad because James thinks it's bad. Like any judgment has that subject-object character where there's a thing, and then there's this impression that there's a you who thinks it's bad or good. And then if you stop resisting, you realize that there isn't actually a separate self, a separate thing. There's just what's here. And without judgment, it's utterly perfect, utterly whole, utterly complete, utterly free from suffering. And so, there was just the most profound thing ever. And that's why I was like, I want more people to have access to this. And as a teenager who was put off by the dogma of Catholicism, I don't think I would have found my way to spirituality through the way it's often spoken about. I wanted to lay down a path to people who were more like me, who were quite alienated and traumatized and scared and wanted the scientific, being held by the hand, get into this stuff. Because if people are making outrageous claims, or if they're like, abusive guru like, and cult leaders, like that whole vibe was just like, no, I would have found this well-being personally as someone who was coming from that state. So I was like, I know there are people like me out there who won't find this stuff unless someone like them can try and be like, it's okay, like this is real, it's important, we can show our working with science, so you don't have to trust me. Like, again, the whole rejecting dogma thing was like, the deepest commitment for me was never to be like, I'm special, like listen to me, I just trust me, like I had a cool experience. It's always like, show my working, this isn't about me, this is about what I'm trying to communicate. So that's really what's fueled me my entire life, really, to try and understand this stuff and try and communicate it.
And do you feel, thank you for sharing, by the way, do you feel then from your own experiences, there's a direct relationship in healing your own traumas, like what we've already spoken about, to then the spiritual relationship with reality, our experience?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in my case, I said how the sense of being a separate self is an interpretation, or it's an idea. It's like, it's not really there. It's like so it's, that functions when it comes to the paradigm of thinking from the mind, that's the first foundation stone. That's the thing the mind stands on and says, all right, the first thing I know is that there's a duality here. There's not just oneness, there's me and the world. And from that point, I'm going to start building up this whole conceptual map of reality. And so the reason it doesn't feel like we can just opt out of the bondage of suffering is because we don't question the assumption that we're separate. We don't question until we start doing this stuff. And so the average person is in that mental paradigm of thinking their thoughts, their interpretations of reality are literally real, rather than realizing it's all mental stuff. And it's all mental stuff arising in boundlessness and freedom, which is always, how reality is. So when you have that, the awakening is fundamentally like the bottom dropping out of that mental paradigm of like the sense of self. I mean, the whole thing kind of crumbles, but you could emphasize that it's because that bottom piece has crumbled. And now you're in the free flow of reality. There is no longer this hard stop of like, I guess it's like the mind thinks there are hard stops in existence. It thinks that you are the body, and when the body dies, like that's a hard stop for your reality. And like this is like, your likes and dislikes. There's like a hard stop with like who you are and how you relate to the world. And it's like a discovering there are no hard stops in reality. Your true nature is beingness, and it will always just keep changing and flowing. So when you do that, then that flowing, open nature means that traumas, I think, can pass through and be resolved in a way that you can't do as thoroughly if you're trying to keep holding that foundation stone of feeling like a separate self in place. So I think that's why conventional therapy, it doesn't challenge and question that separate self. And so you're standing on your fundamental repression mechanism, because that's kind of what it is. It's a way of not having all your traumas and stuff flow through at all times, which is useful for functioning. I'm not putting it down. But yeah, it's good to know there's a reason we use different language, even though this stuff is still happening in experience. There's a reason we talk about spirituality is different to therapy or usual psychology, because it is this existential reckoning where you can come into some deep homeostatic kind of rebalancing with reality. And I think that's why my symptoms resolved, and why, from the perspective of science, of people who are standing from that view of self, this stuff sounds kind of kooky and weird, and they're like, oh, what, you had spontaneous healing? Like, what, is this some kind of miracle? But again, from going through it, you're like, oh no, this is just what the body does. The body can heal. Like, if you cut your hand, it heals up, right? It looks miraculous. It kind of is, but that's the principle of life. That's what I was referring to earlier with the core thing of life. It's not that the genes are like the star of the show. I think if there is a star of the show, the whole thing hangs together, so it's not really. But what seems salient to me is that wholeness, that healing, that tendency towards homeostasis, which is this term we use for this, keeping everything in the right range for life. So having a cut isn't conducive to staying alive over a long time. So that's why it heals, because we just have this tendency towards wholeness. So it makes sense that with healing, this stuff comes out. And I think that's why trauma is something people talk about a lot in spirituality space, because it's when you disrupt the self, you're disrupting your fundamental repression mechanism.
So here's a question for you then, because I know, let's say somebody's listening to this and they're definitely diving down the rabbit hole and open to everything we're chatting about, but they might have children with skin conditions. They might have somebody in the family with asthma or gut issues, and the things that you spoke about, the symptoms healing up once you address the trauma. Right. What do you feel then is the fundamental linchpin, if you like, to allow the body to, like the cut in the arm, to rework itself? That might seem miraculous, but is actually just the body getting back to its natural state.
So the key word I would say is surrender, which is a kind of or opening. So those are two kind of the same movement I'm pointing to, which is the separate self feeling is one of feeling separate and guarded and like you have to defend yourself. And so that's why there's a kind of like a struggling or trying to take a position with reality. Whereas if you can surrender and let reality be reality, let it flow through and not resist it, which is the same as opening to it, connecting to it. Again, it's not really that's separate to us. It's just this movement of openness. I think that's the direction that healing happens in. And so I should also clarify that, with the current medical model that's really excessive with its, everything, including mental health disorders, are basically meaningless. They're just physical aberrations. There's nothing to see here when it comes to your traumas, your personal history. Like that's the kind of the message, I think, a lot of the time. And then when you discover that so much stuff can be based in trauma, like basically all of my stuff was based in trauma, it seems, then you can really swing to the opposite direction and be like, okay, nothing has any kind of random physical basis. That's all a lie. But it's not quite true. I should point out that like someone could behave in a antisocial way because they're like they've had childhood trauma and they're really defensive and they're aggressive and like all this stuff. Someone could also just have been exposed to lead and they literally just stopped impaired their brain development. Like that can happen. Like, so I'm just mentioning that because I'm not dismissing that someone with like a rare genetic disorder is having something that really does arise just from a genetic disorder. But we've taken, like, those things are quite rare, and we've taken that principle in general because it feels more, sometimes people don't want to go through the pain of healing. They want to have a story that allows them just to be like, oh, my IBS isn't chronic anxiety, because that would make me, I'd have to go to therapy, I'd have to think about my mom and my dad and all that stuff. It's just it's garlic, that's it, I can't eat garlic, it's not that the garlic is triggering there's some complex interaction. No, it's just a physical random thing. So yeah, I'm just mentioning that because we shouldn't put the message out that, or I don't want to put the message out that absolutely everything is healable through inner work, but I think people would be surprised about the amount of stuff that is.
It's a large percentage, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the world today,
my impression is, yeah.
I mean, honestly, I don't watch TV, right? But if I do, if I catch it, if I'm walking in to get a coffee and there's a TV on in the background or walks, it's like the world's gone crazy, mate. Like when I'm seeing it from this perspective,
absolutely.
like it has gone absolutely mental. Like, and the fear that's projected constantly. And I just wonder, I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but what would the world look like if we openly started to address these very things that we spoke about, to politicians, to the medical system, to scientists, to everyone, and said that this is actually something we need to bring to the table?
The way that I tend to work with like the book that I've written and the Once I Plan to Write in Future is I've got basically like two more books that I've got in me that I've already got planned, and they all kind of came about because of this journey of surrendering. Like after the awakening, it took a few decades for me to really get deep into the healing the trauma, and I wasn't doing trauma work when I was like 14. It took a while. And really what's happened is as I was doing that work, the mind was trying to make sense of the world and my position and what happened. And that's what on the way led to insights, and I wrote those insights down, and they saw how they came together. And that's kind of what my writing is really, I think of it almost like the way a snake leaves like a shell, or like sheds its skin, and then so I've grown into the present moment, into groundedness, and all this intellectual stuff has kind of come off as like this detritus that's, I mean, not to make it sound negative, but it's because I think hopefully they're good maps, that can help people go on similar journeys. And so one of the things my mind really chewed on a lot was this social piece, this like political, social, healing the world, like what the heck is wrong with us, collective trauma, collective ego. So yeah, I like talking about this stuff. And it's funny that like after putting all these different pieces together, I realized, again, that thing I mentioned of surrender, like the message really is, you said how from this perspective, the world looks crazy. And because we're talking here about a very simple somatic groundedness of like being able to just kind of stop, be present. And like, I can't remember who it was who said there's like all of the world's problems stems from man's inability to sit alone with himself in a quiet room. And like, it's that thing of like, we can't just be at peace. And like, if we can just physically relax and be at peace, that when you've tasted that and when you can live from that, it's really clear that not doing that is just the engine of suffering and discord and chaos in the world at all levels. I mean, again, caveat apart from the hurricanes, whatever, but even that is feeds back through climate change. And so our collective psyche is, it really comes down to separation, that this first foundation stone of not feeling at home in the world. There's a kind of assumption that I'm something alienated, separate, that needs to defend itself, that the death of the body is the ultimate, most important thing, and all the other meanings like scaffold on top of that. And so I think to get to a better world, there needs to be a reckoning with that. You can't just have political change and without a spiritual, like a deep reckoning with our existential situation and reckoning with ourselves. We need to look at ourselves in the mirror and face reality, in my opinion, in order to kind of shed the struggle. Like we're in this struggle, and we need to basically stop doing that. And a world like that, I think, would look like it's not just a case of individuals doing it. I mentioned retreats and in-person stuff. I think we would need communities of care, like communities where people really come together and prioritize the good stuff in life that's always free, like connection, creativity, spending time in nature, all that stuff. And to see that the systems we currently live in, the consumerism, you mentioned TV, like that stuff is meant to disempower you. It's meant to, I don't mean there's some kind of, this is intentionally done. It's like, oh, if we do this, then this will disempower people. But it's more, it just evolves in an organic way of like, people that like, you work at the job, for someone else to then give your money to another company to buy something that will entertain you, so you can like numb yourself while because of the stress of the job. Like it's a treadmill of disempowerment. And I think a better world would be one in which people woke up to be like, this isn't it. Like this isn't life. Like what life is, being present, is being connected, is living community. And yes, I think it would be radically empowered. Like people would just choose to wake up to that empowerment. But it's a hard road because it forces you to face your traumas, and you need that care piece, I think. So I think to ignite that better world, there needs to be like a critical mass of wise people who are genuinely wise and caring and can hold space for people, not who just claim they can, but like literally you're in the room with these people, and nervous system to nervous system, you can feel it's like no bullshit. Like this is a safe person. We need enough healed people like that, so that people can start to go, okay, like this feels safe enough that I can join this movement in this direction. And this, last thing I'll say is that it's basically that thing of the body and the tension. I noticed in myself, I did a lot of kind of psychedelic work to heal the trauma stuff, and there were times when I would be in a real clench of like stress of like being in the trauma, and say like the breathing was like a freeze state. And I remember, the mind would be like, how am I going to get out of this? Like I just feel I'm just in it, and like opening to it to process it, turning towards the shadow stuff. So I don't want to struggle with it. I want to open to it. I'm just in this like complete freeze. I'm just like I have nothing I can do. I can't get out of it. And then suddenly something, maybe it's just a hand opens, it starts to relax, and then the arm relaxes, and then it washes over the whole body. And you see this when you look at imaging of electrical signaling in tissues. It's how it works, like waves of like so much stuff is communicated in waves of energy and electrical activity through the body. And it's like you just need that little starting point, and then it sends the signal through the whole system, and it can relax. And it's like, okay, now I'm breathing. And I think the same thing is kind of what I'm describing on a social level. If you think of each of us as like a cell in a superorganism of the human creature that's so tensed and reactive, we need some like small area where there's enough of this signal, like this is working. Okay, like we've figured it out. We've found how to ground, and then that needs to spread. I think it has to happen at some point. But there could be a lot of bumps on the way, like it's like a disillusion that would lead to a better thing. So there would be a lot of chaos, I think, in that transition. But at the same time, I mean, maybe not, because we're moving towards a groundedness, a holding, anyway, those my kind of thoughts on what that would look like.
Yeah, no, beautiful. Thank you for sharing. It's funny, like that's exactly what happens at our retreats. It's that very process you said, and then it just rushes through towards the end, and it's like, whoa. Yeah. And there's a huge one.
The whole system wants it. It's like this gravitational pull to surrender, to relax, but it just can't figure it out, and it just needs to be seeded, I guess is the word, to seed it, and then it spreads.
Yeah. But I feel what you mentioned as well, that we all need to look at ourselves in the mirror and really take ownership of it. I think that's definitely key, isn't it? And realize that we can contribute to the greater whole. And if we stop throwing rocks at everything that's wrong with the world, and actually start pointing ourselves back in.
The reason that you're absolutely right, that's the kind of the mechanism is the looking at ourselves in the mirror. And I used to think like that was the kind of, like that's the thing I used to talk about, is like we need to face ourselves. And then I kind of realized the reason now we're talking about community and holding spaces, I think it's a bit like, it's easy to kind of finger wag and say like, say someone who's behaving in a really toxic way, you'd be like, you really need to take responsibility and stop doing that. Like that's a reasonable sentiment. But then if you think of, you don't know what their traumas are and what their history is and what their social support is like. And so if you imagine someone who's like psychotic with they're so stressed, or they've hit this like psychotic point, and they're like delusional, and they're trying to like attack, and they're cornered, and they're like lashing out at people. If that person, like I say, they've got a knife or something, if you're just like, you need to face yourself and stop doing this, like the finger wagging is like, what's that gonna, come on, like that's doing nothing. Like you need to, and this comes out of a kind of empathy thing of not othering and being like, even the most harmful people are us with different conditioning. That's the thing of seeing through the self thing. There is no magical extra ingredient of James that means that if you put James in some evil dictator's body, that I wouldn't be that evil dictator. I would be. Like, it's just the conditioning. There's no extra ingredient. And so when you see that, okay, well, what would have had to have happened to me? What would have to have been my circumstances to make me behave like that? Because we do all have this, I believe, this like fundamental desire to like orient towards the best possible situation. And so if the situation is bad, it's probably because what you feel is on offer is there isn't a good range. And I say what you feel is on offer because often you can be offering someone something, a really good way out, but they don't see it because the way the mind, we see our past experiences really filter how reality looks to us, So someone could be coming to you with a real offer of support and it could look very threatening to you. And you don't think it looks threatening, you just think it is threatening. Your perception is so clouded by your past traumas and stuff. I mean, that's just how perception works. So yeah, that's why I always think to that piece of like, what's the causes and conditions we could change here instead of putting it on the individual to allow that person to then face themselves.
And what do you think that ingredient is then for that person within themselves? Is it the willingness to change that needs to be the first step in terms of, I'm ready? Because otherwise we continuing to try and take the horse to water, but they're just not going to drink.
Yeah. My impression is that people genuinely don't realize there's another way. That like when you're so far down the tunnel, that like, for me, again, the awakening just hit me over the head. And if someone had said to me, say there was like a clone of me at exactly the same age and they'd said like, oh, I just had this cool experience, like, and it relieved my suffering and maybe you should get into Zen or like, I think again, through that, if I was still that wound up person before the awakening, I probably would have looked at that person and been like, I don't trust you. You're probably trying to hit my money, or I just don't trust, I don't believe you, basically. So I think that's the thing is you can't, that's why in things like Buddhism, they talk about evil being delusion, basically. It's just that mechanism by which we misperceive reality and we see things in a deluded way where we're not seeing clearly. That is the problem. And so there is, I guess I think of it like the thing to do is, I mentioned there's like this gravitational pull to surrender. It's a bit like, water running downstream. The best you can do is carve channels to make things easier for people. So if you go to someone and be like, you should do this, I know what you need, or that's not it. Whereas if you show up and you support people, and perhaps if you just let yourself be an example for if you carry yourself in a way where you're like, that person seems to have figured something out, let people pick up on it in that way. And it requires a kind of non-attachment or a non needing to fix the world. And that's a kind of an irony, is that I think the level of shedding the struggle I mentioned earlier is like stopping the struggle with reality. To do that at the deepest level, we actually need to fall in love with the world exactly as it is. We need to not be in that ego thing that's like, no, like I can't deal with this. It's too much for me. Because always what that is saying there's a bit of me that I don't feel up for facing right now, because it's triggering some part of me that I don't want to face. And it is possible to face yourself so deeply that you can go, wow, climate change is really going to be absolutely horrific. And you can just feel the grief of that and see it as a kind of obvious thing. And it doesn't have to be a second thing of the mind being like, no, but I don't want it there. Just like this whole struggling with it. And I think that is how we put out the fire of separation and of ego and of struggle, is to first grieve and accept and open to ourselves fully. And from there, it's not non-attachment, like I don't care what's going to happen. Then again, as it's attested to in Buddhism, from that state, compassion arises, and you do what you can, in the most grounded, wise way possible to help to put out the fires.
Mate, that quote you just said really landed. We need to fall in love with the world exactly the way it is. I
don't say that lightly. I mean, it's
I know.
I've faced that again and again and feel like, no, do I though? Like maybe I can find an angle on this, maybe. And then again, I guess like, no, you got to do it. You got to do it.
I feel like, because the podcast, I'm running out of time, but I feel like there's so many topics we haven't covered today, and we've literally just scratched the surface with you. I know, right? I thought we were like 15 minutes in. It's crazy, isn't it? But I want to just, instead of diving into new topics, I want to actually ask you a question around surrender then. It's such a big word, or for people to even lean into that concept. How do you live your life now on a daily basis with surrender in mind? Because you're living in Portugal. I don't know if you finished your retreat center, have you? Is it open? Is it ready? Or
it's very close to being finished, so it should be open 2025.
You're a guy from London living in Portugal. I have no doubt there's a lot of surrender and trust going into what you're doing right now, which is amazing. You got a book coming out. There's all these things that we tend to love the idea of, but we don't. We stay in our day job and we go forward. So I'm just curious how you live your life with that in mind.
Yeah, it's funny because I do think what you point to here is that I wouldn't, if I was operating from the small self, James, that if I thought that was real, I probably wouldn't be doing all this, because the stress needs to be able to move through. And as I mentioned before, for me, these trauma release exercises from David Berceli were really powerful, where you learn to tremor. And so now, I live in a very, constantly somatically opening state where the moment there's any stress, to say there's something stressful happens and there's a gasp of a tension in the chest, there's immediately an orienting to that, softening, opening, becoming mindful. So there's this it's like any knots of resistance are constantly being unraveled. And so my spiritual practice, my path is not different to life. It's completely, there's no separation between them. It's just this constant opening. And I think that it does come down to that opening to experience in an embodied way, stopping, surrendering. But yeah, it's funny, just on a practical level, when we started this project, I'm lucky that my wife is in a similar, she wanted to do something similar. You have to be with a similar kind of, like-minded person to do something like this. And when we started, we both had this thing of we don't want to, we don't want to be old and be we wanted to do that thing, but we never did it. We didn't do enough. We never lived life fully enough. And it was about a year ago as we were finishing the main phase of the construction of this, and it was so stressful. And I was just I know now that I've reached my limit. I've overshot. I've done enough. I'm not going to look back when I'm older and be I didn't live fully enough. I really took on a lot with this. So yeah, it's on a basic human level, it's nice to acknowledge that this is it's anyone who wants to renovate a ruin in the middle of the mountains and build a retreat center. It's no joke.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. Do you feel that in some way? I'm just trying to think of the right question around it, so if it doesn't come out, but that you're being guided, that there's an intuitive aspect to you that you develop, and it's if I listen to this and lean into this as opposed to just my analytical mind processing everything, then everything is going to work out in nature. It just works out in this incredible, beautiful form. Yeah,
so I mentioned the thing before that, everything I do, it happens in a very organic or intuitive way, is the way I would say it, where it's I never resist what if things are showing me there's a block here, I'm not going to struggle with it. In the Tao, they talk about the power of water that can kind of carve through mountains, because it doesn't struggle. It's not going to try and go uphill. It goes where the cracks are, and it's So I feel I listen to reality, and I let it do what it's going to do. And the good thing is again, it's early when I was trying to articulate the perfection of reality, and I want to say everything's where it needs to be, but it's not that it actually needs to be anywhere, because I don't think about it in those kind of terms of as you were saying, but it's more everything is where it is, and if you don't judge it, it's perfect. So it's a bit even if to say no one, say the retreat center was a failure or something, and then we sold it and we did something else, and the journey goes on. There is no, it doesn't have to be that you trust and hey, everyone becomes a millionaire because I trusted, and stuff like that. When you're in that state of doing what's aligned, sure, amazing things can happen because you are where you're supposed to be and you're being authentic, and so people resonate with it. But at the same time, it's life. So there are no guarantees with life. It's just, to me, I guess it's just the only way to be, is to be in the openness, the non-resistance, to let reality do its thing. Because it's always going to do what it's going to do, and to try and position yourself as a small self that's fighting with it, I've found it's a losing game. So I don't recommend it.
Yeah, no, thank you. And last thing I want to mention, you got a new book coming out, The Dawn of Mind. You got a 2-year-old, you said. You've been building a retreat center. How did you find the time to write this book? I'm curious as well.
I think when my mother-in-law came to visit, that was when I got a good chunk of it done. So so shout out to her for that. It's the book itself is very it's very much kind of reckoning with reality and our place within it. So I'm not really talking about, it's kind of like a good foundation if you're intellectually curious for the kind of stuff we've been talking about. And I plan to talk more about the more practical self-help, stuff in future, and the social stuff. But yeah, this book is very much like what is going on with reality, which I find as people are surrendering into reality, we do become curious about, especially as you wake up to it not being the way you thought it was. It's natural to be like, well, what is going on? So it's in that kind of aspect of the path.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, congratulations. I hope everyone listening to this will go out and grab a copy of that book. And it's a perfect gift as well. I see these things as windows in to support not only ourselves, but people that we care about around us that might be starting to become curious, right?
Yeah. It's out before Christmas, so why not buy 5 copies for everyone you know? Yeah,
exactly. Look, and website as well. Where can people buy the book's going to be available everywhere? I'm guessing
the book is available everywhere. Amazon, wherever you would get it. And my handle on every platform basically is Dr. James Cooke with the on the end. That's drjamescooke.com. But then my main project at the moment is innerspaceinstitute.org, which is a kind of it's what I have all these different projects I'm doing, like the book and writing, and I have a podcast called Living Mirrors, and retreats, and I made a bunch of kind of guided meditations, and I wanted to bring them all together into a single thing where, if you're interested in any of this stuff, check out innerspaceinstitute.org, especially if you're interested in the more self-help, practical, self-help maybe isn't the right word, but inner work, I guess, is the best word for it, the practical stuff to do with awakening and non-duality and, waking up to our place in existence, because I've got a lot of resources there. Free, and there's also a membership option where people can kind of take part in the community and help build into a bigger project. Those are the main places I'd point to people.
Beautiful. Well, congratulations on everything you're doing, mate. It really is wonderful, and I certainly hope this podcast brings some much needed awareness to what you're doing as well, mate. I feel there's so many questions I wanted to dive into today. What is consciousness, reality, beyond our perceptions, even my own Kundalini awakening, like with the nervous system, there's so many things. But maybe you can come back on next year sometime, and
I'd love that.
We could dive into the mystical aspects of things, of what you've learned, and the psychedelic journey, ayahuasca. Oh my God, it just goes on.
Lots to talk about.
Lots to go on. But James, thanks so much, mate. I really enjoyed. Thank you.
Thanks, guy. I really enjoyed it.